question that students commonly ask is if they can find their own fieldwork opportunity in occupational therapy school. The answer is it kind of depends, because there's a continuum of possibilities in terms of what the student can do when it comes to finding their own fieldwork, depending on really the school that you attend. So what I mean on a spectrum is there are some schools where you are not expected to find it on your own, and there is an academic fieldwork coordinator who does that job for you. On the other end of the spectrum, you're expected to find the fieldwork placement by yourself. I think this is quite rare when it comes to OT school. I've seen this in more like nursing programs. And then somewhere in the middle is where you have a fieldwork coordinator, but in circumstances where you find your own placement, or if you want to find your own placement, it is possible. And I actually asked this question directly to ACOTE, and I messaged them and reached out if this was actually true. Like one student that I've mentored said, hey, like the school said I actually can't find a fieldwork setting on my own. Is this actually like the case? Is this really true? So they responded, the student may very well be correct that their program does not allow for the student to reach out to potential sites at all. The 2018 standards require that institutions have an academic fieldwork coordinator, AFWC, who is responsible for all of the C standards, which are the fieldwork standards. And the AFWC has to ensure that the site meets the needs and all the requirements, review the objectives, and so on, end quote. So that's not to say that, well, you can't find it on your own if your school kind of allows it. So like I really mentioned earlier, it depends on the school that you attend. So this is a really important consideration if you're someone who is watching this video and applying to OT schools, is like if you're weighing one school between another, if one school doesn't allow you to find it at all versus another one that may allow you to find it, then that may be an important consideration, because you never know what kind of ethical issues may come up. Let me give you a scenario where actually in my own cohort, a classmate was able to use this finding of their own fieldwork site in their school experience. For reasons many that I actually don't know, the student didn't want to use that fieldwork that was recommended or assigned to them. So this student, they were able to find their own. Basically, it was somewhere that they shadowed before they were an OT student. And they coordinated actually all of it with the OT and the site. And they kind of got everything going, basically. And then they touched base with the fieldwork coordinator to get the final okay and to sign off on it. So this worked out for my classmate because they were able to use this alternative fieldwork site, and they used the one that they found themselves. Of course, it's not always that easy. It depends on many situations and criteria. There's a lot of standards to meet. So it's not like a very smooth and straightforward process like it was for my classmate. It really depends on really if it's a level 1 and a level 2. And a lot of these things are actually beyond the scope of my knowledge because I'm not an AFWC. Now, I actually don't know if any schools expect students to find it on their own. I know this is, like I mentioned, true for certain nursing programs and more advanced degrees, but there are pros and cons to that too, right? The pro is being able to find a site that you really want to go to. You already have one in mind. You really like a certain practice area, you work well with the team, it's local and close to you, then this has a really good advantage. The con, of course, is, well, it can come with a lot of stress and anxiety if you're expected to, this is the job for the AFWC, and this is responsibility is put on you as a student. That can be very stressful. But of course, things change. I don't know what will happen in the future in the making of this video. So just in the possibility and realm of possibilities when it comes to the spectrum of whether you can find your own fieldwork site and what the expectations are. So now you're wondering, why did my classmates seek one on their own? Or if there is an AFWC and most of the time they do a good job of finding a site for you and it's a lot of work, why would a student like you want to find a fieldwork site on your own or an alternative one in the first place? Well, there are many reasons to this. I kind of alluded to this earlier, is the issue of ethics, right? I'm not saying that your academic fieldwork coordinator is necessarily unethical, but think about how a fieldwork site may be unethical, and there are a lot of things going on, and maybe your AFWC, whether it's a level 1 or level 2, may or may not agree with it. If you, after all, the student, you're the one who's paying for this, you're the one who's going out on this fieldwork site, you ultimately have the final say, right, of whether you actually want to go. And if you kind of sense or you see some red flags with the fieldwork site, such as when you're going out on a tour, you're orienting, or you're do your own research, or when you're interviewing with them, just something that doesn't seem right, or there's a lot of evidence that doesn't really make it seem like this fieldwork site is like meeting the requirements for like a fieldwork experience, then you may want to actually not go ahead, first of all, proceed with this fieldwork setting, and two, maybe consider an alternative, right? So now let's take a look at some of the ACOTE requirements, the actual ACOTE requirements. I'm going to read three. They're not the complete list of them. You can find this on the ACOTE website. So think about how a fieldwork site may actually not meet these standards or requirements as I read these. The first one is the fieldwork educator and student should have access to current professional information, publications, texts, and internet resources related to occupational therapy, education, and practice. So an example of what may violate this for like a setting is, for example, if a student or the OT that they are shadowing or like having be their clinical instructor, either or both of them don't have access to like their phones or computer throughout their shift. Okay, standard number two, client records should be available to the staff and students for intervention planning and practice. An example of this is, well, first of all, if the student doesn't have access to these records, or along these lines, kind of similar vein, what if the OT themselves doesn't do any documentation and therefore the student wouldn't do any documentation? OTs are supposed to document what they do for an official OT role. Otherwise, if you don't document, how do you know something is done in the first place? And the third requirement, again, this isn't the complete list, but one that I wanted to bring up is that, quote, the educational value of the student fieldwork experience should be of primary importance, and the placement should not be used to extend services offered by the fieldwork agency. So this one is kind of self-explanatory, but think about like what I mentioned in like the second point is, even if you have an OT who is working at a certain role, if they're not doing like real OT, they just happen to be an OT, then it can be kind of questionable if you're an OT student, whether you'll be getting the most out of your fieldwork experience if really you're there just to extend the services of the fieldwork site. Maybe they're short on staff, like there's a labor shortage, they don't have enough volunteers, and well, hey, look, here's a fieldwork student, maybe they can help do this job. They can kind of volunteer for us, right? Like free labor, right? Of course, this isn't like very black and white. There's like a lot of like specifics. Each setting and each situation can be different. But if you sense something like this and there's a red flag that kind of goes off, then you want to question if this is an appropriate fieldwork site. You know, just because it was assigned to you, something may not be right. And this is where it kind of falls in the realm of the ethics and the standards not being met for a fieldwork site, right? Because, you know, it's the real world. Things can change, and maybe there are kind of bad players out there, maybe intentional, maybe unintentional. So as you can see, based on these kind of standards and like what I mentioned, the three, and just situations that kind of may violate these or not meet the requirements, students may actually want to seek their own fieldwork placement, or at least get another one, right? Whether it's having a fieldwork coordinator find another one for them or to find one on their own. Overall, here's some advocacy for you if you're an OT student going out on fieldwork. Students should be treated like adults, first of all, right? They should be listened to. There are some situations where students should stand up for themselves and advocate for themselves, like you and your best interest. You're paying for this experience, right? So if you especially don't feel listened to or you don't feel safe at a fieldwork site, then you should not consider going. And this may actually mean even deferring like graduation or whatever it is, because ultimately it's your own experience. This is like literally something you can put on your resume. It's like your own internship, right? This can be somewhere where you can land a job potentially, you know? So it's like a really big deal, especially if it's a level 2. So I'm not saying like, okay, maybe like you're a student and you're like being like extra choosy, like, oh, I want this like ideal, like dreamy, like perfect one. Like, I'm not saying you to be like overly picky. I'm saying in issues where ethics are violated, or just the fieldwork site has some red flags, it doesn't meet a quote requirements. These are the situations where you really need to be standing up for yourself, voicing your concerns, not being gaslit and like having people tell you, oh, like you're a student, you don't know any better, or you're just being like overly anxious, or it'll be all right. Many students have done this before, right? How do you know these previous students weren't like taken advantage of? You should really try to come up with a solution, right? So first of all, if you have an AFWC, try and talk to them, and of course, talk to them in a professional manner, right? Just don't be rude, of course, right? Provide the evidence that you came up with and why, come up with a case of why you don't think it is a fieldwork site that is suited to you and why it's not suited to other students, especially. Sometimes there may be in some situations, like I've read online, where you may not be able to come up with a solution with the AFWC. Maybe the AFWC may be kind of biased, right? They may be intentionally biased, unintentionally biased. They may favor some students more than others. I've read of some cases like this too, right? This is not beyond the realm of possibility, right? Humans are humans, right? Just because an AFWC is an AFWC doesn't mean that they may be fair, right? They should be fair and equal to all students. So along these lines, what if you don't trust your AFWC, or you don't get along with them, or you don't have confidence in them being able to reach a resolution? Well, another option is to speak with the program director or with student services from the school, or anybody else you think may be able to be on your side, first of all, and listen to you and be able to make things happen. Last is that a complaint should be filed with ACOTE. Even it can be done anonymously. So a student should consider this if, for example, even if you may not choose to do this right away, you can do it like after like some things resolve. It's still at the end of the day important for you to file a complaint if you think a complaint is warranted, because, well, you think about future students in the profession. They're going to be potentially faced with going to this fieldwork site that may not meet the standards, it may be unethical, or whatever reason it may be. You can learn more about this process, and like you can definitely get your questions answered, because your situation may be very specific, by first of all contacting ACOTE, and they're really receptive to questions and answering, and they're really, really helpful. Second is you can also do a Google search for ACOTE VB complaints, and this pulls up a guide on how you can reach out for filing complaint, and will provide you with a lot of information. I usually end the video like this. What are some of your experiences? You don't have to be very specific, like you don't need to mention the school, but you can be very like general. What are some of your experiences, first of all, when it comes to, are you allowed to find your own fieldwork site? Are you even expected to? Second is, what are some of your experiences where you may have experienced a really bad fieldwork site, or you kind of avoided one because of that? And what are some of the issues when it comes to interactions with like your fieldwork coordinator and other professionals or faculty or educators on the team when it comes to reaching a solution? Or have you even filed an ACOTE complaint before? So let me know in the comments. Hopefully this helps and provides some insight